Okay, welcome. Why don't we get started? Sorry, my toddler is in the back crushing a chocolate chip cookie, and okay. It's great to see all of you here for today's conversation with Professor Francis Lee and Professor Steve Macedo about their vital book, In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us. Many colleagues at Dartmouth recognize the importance of this conversation and we're grateful for their support, including our colleagues at the Ethics Institute, Government Department, the Dartmouth Institute, Dartmouth Dialogues, and the Associate Dean for the Social Sciences and Dean of Faculty. Of course, many of us in this room worked on various aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic as researchers, commentators, public health and medical practitioners, and policymakers. It was a foundational moment politically, economically, and socially. And while it's also a moment that's uncomfortable to return to, today's visitors argue that we must. So just take a moment and think back to February of 2020 and the pandemic's earliest days, to spring and summer of 2020 and the ups and downs they brought, to the fall of 2020 and the 2020 election, to early 2021 and the arrival of vaccines, and finally to the larger political and cultural cleavages that surfaced during the COVID era, that the pandemic era itself transformed, and that persist in our politics and culture to this day. Steve Macedo and Francis Lee are the ideal experts to help us think through what all of this means. Lee is Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton, where she's co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, or CSDP. She is, as you know, a leading authority on congressional politics, national politics, party politics, and representation. She is also parliamentarian at Princeton, an experience about which at least I hope she will someday write. Steve Macedo is Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Politics at Princeton and the University Center for Human Values, or UCHV, where he's also acting director. He's a leading authority on political theory, ethics, American constitutionalism, public policy, and civil society, and he also chairs the Tanner Lectures Committee there. As you'll see today, Macedo and Lee ask big questions and answer them with rigor, and their influence as scholars, public intellectuals, mentors, and institutional stewards is enormous. A brief note on format before we begin. They'll present for about 25 minutes, then they'll be joined by my colleague, Professor Brendan Nyhan, James O. Freeman, Presidential Professor and Professor of Government, and leading authority on political misinformation and communication. He'll ask about 10 minutes of questions, and then we will open it up to all of you for 20 minutes. And with that, it's an honor to have you both here today, and please join me in welcoming Professors Lee and Macedo to Dartmouth.
Thank you. Let's see if I can just tick that a little bit. The drill is I'm going to speak for a few minutes, and then Francis will speak for a few minutes, and then I'll speak for a minute, and then we'll turn it over. So thank you so much. Thank you to the Rockefeller Center and all the other institutions at Dartmouth that are sponsors. We've had a delightful visit with the students and colleagues, and really happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So I'm just going to go through this then. The book is about, in the largest sense, elite failure, especially the failure of what we think of as the truth-seeking departments of liberal democracy. And we seek to assess their performance during the COVID pandemic. And that includes science, journalism, universities, who have independence and whose mandate is to ask questions and seek the best evidence on them. And we think they didn't perform nearly as well as they should have during the COVID pandemic, and our book is a retrospective account of that. The influence of polarization, politicization, there was intolerance of dissent, and also an unwillingness to look back on what is admittedly an unpleasant era, but a very important set of events in American politics. So we think that some loss of trust in elite institutions is understandable, given these matters. Of course, it was a terrible pandemic. The pictures from and memories from March and April 2020 are still disturbing. In Italy, the reports were that it was a tsunami in northern Italy, hospital wards being overwhelmed. In New York City, body bags in makeshift morgues, refrigerated trucks outside of hospitals. There was a lot of fear, a lot of panic, and we acknowledged that. But it was the greatest global crisis since World War II in many ways, the worst pandemic since the Great Flu of 1918 to 1919. Astonishingly, as bad as the pandemic was, the response was also astonishing. By early April 2020, half the world's population, 3.9 billion people, was under some form of lockdown, an attempt to suppress a respiratory pandemic on a scale that we've never attempted before in human history. And of course, mistakes were made. We're Monday morning quarterbacks, as some students have pointed out. That's the role of social science. And yet we try to provide a comprehensive reassessment, trying to be as objective as we can be. So first of all, we have some chapters on what was known about pandemic planning before the COVID pandemic. In fact, there had been decades of pre-COVID pandemic planning. So what did those documents suggest? The World Health Organization put out a systematic review in November 2019. It expressed uncertainty about the whole range of non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdowns, the school closures, and so on that were implemented. It rated the evidence very low, very weak for each of these measures. But on page 3 of that document, it listed several measures as not recommended in any circumstances, even in the worst pandemic. And those measures included contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals, entry and exit screening, and border closures, measures that were all implemented in short order under COVID. The document emphasized, as did others, that school closures raised major ethical issues for families and communities. The pre-COVID pandemic plans were eloquent, not just on the uncertainty of the evidence for NPIs, but the certainty of severe costs for society if these measures were implemented. The Johns Hopkins University put out another plan in September 2019, just months before the pandemic. It is important to communicate to political leaders the absence of evidence surrounding many non-pharmaceutical measures and the adverse consequences that may follow from them. They were enthusiasts for non-pharmaceutical intervention measures under the George W. Bush administration. He had read John Barry's book on the Great Flu of 1918 and was concerned about a future pandemic. So the community that was sympathetic were mainly mathematical modelers who had a strong influence on the George W. Bush Homeland Security and National Security agencies, who issued projections arguing that there could be tremendous positive benefits from NPIs if they were implemented quickly enough. Quotation from their document is, modeling supports school closure as an effective means of reducing overall attack rates within communities. The value of this intervention is maximized if school closure occurs early in the course of a community outbreak. Just how early is early enough was not particularly clearly defined. And of course, the models were based on projections about hoped-for changes rather than empirical evidence. Indeed, the Institute of Medicine in 2006 assembled a group to assess the empirical evidence for these non-pharmaceutical measures. And this group, led by Dr. Adel Mahmoud, who was teaching in the Princeton School of Public Policy at the time, did not endorse these measures. They emphasized that total mortality in the 1918 pandemic was only weakly associated with the interventions, and that the models that were offered in support do not sustain much variation across the cities, don't explain much variation across the cities, and they declined to endorse the use of NPIs in future pandemics. One statement from that document said, it's almost impossible to say that the interventions, either individually or in combination, will be effective. And once again, they warned about the costs, and they also warned that political leaders would have an incentive to use these measures to show that they were in charge for political reasons, not public health reasons. Dr. D.A. Henderson, the famous epidemiologist who led the global effort to eradicate smallpox and was subsequently dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in 1977 to 1990, also registered his skepticism about these non-pharmaceutical measures in an article in 2006. A quote from that article, as experience shows, there is no basis for recommending quarantine, either of groups or individuals. The problems in implementing such measures are formidable, and the secondary effects, such as loss of public trust in government, are likely to be considerable. So the balance of opinion, we think, was emphasizing uncertainty about these measures, the certainty of the costs, and the empirical evidence not being particularly supportive of the implementation of these measures. Now, it's also important to recognize that the American Civil Liberties Union put out a document in 2008 because they recognized the dangers of wedding the values of public health and law enforcement, since they recognized that many of these measures could wind up being mandatory. So the quotations from this document: American history contains vivid reminders that grafting the values of law enforcement and national security onto public health is both ineffective and dangerous. Too often, fears aroused by disease and epidemics have justified abuses of state power. Coercion and brute force gratuitously breed public distrust and encourage the people most in need of care to evade public health authorities. Effective preventive strategies that rely on voluntary participation do work. People are likely to engage willingly in any and all efforts to keep their families and communities healthy. And finally, minorities and other socially disadvantaged populations tend to bear the brunt of tough public health measures. That was the case under COVID as well. So policy turned on a dime in March 2020 under the influence of the Chinese example and the severe lockdowns that were imposed there. The Wuhan lockdown took place on January 22nd, 2020. It was the largest quarantine in human history to that point. 60 million people in Wuhan and Hebei province living under severe lockdown. The initial response was skeptical to the Wuhan lockdown. Dr. Anthony Fauci, January 24th, 2020. That's something I don't think we could possibly do in the United States. I can't imagine shutting down New York or Los Angeles. But the judgment on the part of the Chinese health authorities is that this is something that, in fact, is going to help in containing it. Whether it does or not is really open to question, because historically, when you shut things down, it doesn't have a major effect. And there were other scientists who also registered their skepticism. But on March 16th, 2020, the Imperial College in London put out a document analyzing, again, it was a model projection of what would happen in the absence of these measures. Dr. Neil M. Ferguson was the lead author and one of the original mathematical modelers from 2006. And that document had a major influence. It projected that absent extreme and sustained suppression measures, there could be 2.2 million dead Americans by August 2020, and 500,000 dead in the UK. So a truly frightening projection. But there was dissent, once again. Just summarizing many registrations of dissent, former CDC Director Tom Friedman said in Vox, March 16, "We must consider the huge societal costs of closing schools against what may be little or no health benefit," echoing the pre-COVID pandemic plans. Michael Osterholm, University of Minnesota, one of the world's leading epidemiologists, "We've got people literally just following each other off the edge of a cliff because they're not thinking," imposing these lockdown measures, school closures, and so on. And there were many others. But as we trace the history as best we can of those early months, it seemed like by April, the framing of a wartime mentality and calls for wartime unity came to the fore. So you can see it in the early pandemic memoirs that were written by various people. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the lead medical scientist on CNN, entitled his memoir of the early COVID months, World War C. Dr. Deborah Birx called her memoir Silent Invasion. An early assessment by the COVID pandemic planning group was called Lessons from the COVID War. And indeed, the Harvard Safra Center, an ethics center at Harvard, had done dozens of white papers looking at COVID measures. They issued the first national pandemic planning document in conjunction with the schools of public health and various other experts there. Indeed, they were joined by the Rockefeller Foundation, New America, the Center Libertarian Niskanen Center, and others, institutions that don't normally take policy positions, but signed on to this out of an extraordinary sense of unity, calling for suppression measures, endorsing test, trace, and supportively isolate, endorsing severe suppression measures, and two, the virus could be controlled and limited to very local outbreaks. So they endorsed these widespread application of NPIs. And many other institutions did it as well. And at this point, we believe, and we think there's evidence that there was intolerance of dissent in the face of the call for wartime unity. Dissent was seen beginning now as disloyal. Pandemic policy making was made across the United States, and here I'll hand it over to my co-author, Frances Lee.
Well, we all remember the many press conferences during the pandemic with President Trump and Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx and others. But in point of fact, the key policymakers in the pandemic were the nation's governors. During the crisis, it was the governors who decided on closures and when to lift them. They also oversaw the mass vaccination campaigns that were rolled out across the states. Amid the crisis and uncertainty, they looked to federal officials for guidance, and the coronavirus task force was a key clearinghouse for information. But the key decisions rested with the governors. No clear direction emerged until March the 16th, when the President convened a major press conference with health officials. This was 15 days to slow the spread. At that press conference, the administration issued recommendations that in states with evidence of community transmission, governors should close non-essential businesses and all places where people congregate, including schools. And then stay-at-home orders began to cascade across the states after that. Nearly all the governors issued stay-at-home orders in the aftermath of that March the 16th press conference. And at this point, there were only slight differences between red and blue states in their response. Compared to Democratic governors, Republican governors took just a few more days to issue their stay-at-home orders. They were a little bit more hesitant, but no big difference there. The big variation in the pandemic response emerged during the reopening process. Democratic governors kept their stay-at-home orders in place 2.5 times as long on average as Republican governors. By March the 25th, all public schools in the United States were closed, serving more than 50 million students. Only a handful of public schools would reopen in the spring of 2020, basically Wyoming and North Dakota. But across the South and the Mountain West, many schools reopened in the fall of 2020, August. But nearly half of public schools were still closed in March of 2021. So the school reopening process was far more protracted than the reopening process for the rest of society, and much wider variation across the country. The length of school closures strongly correlates with states' partisan lean as gauged by the 2020 presidential vote. There's a very clear relationship here, but the more Democratic the state, the longer the school closures. At the same time as governors implemented stay-at-home orders in March of 2020, they imposed other orders to enforce social distancing. To track these patterns, researchers at Oxford University have compiled a stringency index to measure the restrictiveness of the pandemic response based on the indicators shown here. And then that index is scaled from 0 to 100 for each jurisdiction, and then they measure it repeatedly over time, with 100 being the strictest and 0 being the lightest. This figure displays the average stringency index score for each month of the pandemic for states grouped by their partisan lean, from strongly Democratic states shown in dark blue to strongly Republican states shown in dark red. The most important thing to note from this figure is that the states stay well sorted by party in the stringency of their COVID restrictions through the pandemic, with Democratic states always more restrictive than Republican states. And you can see party competitive states shown in purple tend to stay in the middle range. And that ordering that just stays consistent. And that's true no matter what's happening in terms of the pandemic, as the pandemic waves would come and go in different places at different times over the course of the crisis. Okay, so we can see that there was a big COVID policy divide that was based heavily on political party. So what were the results? Every state carried out a mass vaccination campaign paid for by federal dollars, but there was markedly higher vaccine uptake in Democratic-leaning states than in Republican-leaning states. It's a nice linear relationship by social science standards there. This figure displays CDC data on cumulative COVID mortality per capita for each month of the pandemic in states grouped by their partisan lean. By January 2023, on the far right-hand side of the graph, Republican-leaning states had suffered mortality rates nearly 30% higher than Democratic-leaning states. However, if you examine the COVID mortality rates over the period before vaccines became available, there's no meaningful difference. The differences in COVID outcomes across Republican and Democratic-leaning states first emerge and then grow progressively wider through the post-vaccine period. The analysis points to a strong relationship between states' level of vaccine uptake and their COVID mortality rates. The least vaccinated state experienced fully 1.6 times as much COVID mortality as the most vaccinated state. However, the different policies that states pursued before vaccines were available do not correlate with COVID mortality. States that imposed stay-at-home orders more quickly did not fare better. You can see California was first, South Carolina was last. It's about a 3-week difference, but there's not a relationship between overall COVID mortality and the speed with which those stay-at-home orders were announced. The length of stay-at-home orders also does not correlate with COVID mortality. States that imposed more stringent COVID restrictions, as gauged by that Oxford index, did not fare better than states that imposed less stringent COVID restrictions. States that kept schools closed longer did not fare better than states that reopened them more quickly. Now, it's important to acknowledge that one can't conclude from these scatter plots or similar analyses that these measures don't work. A proper reading here is simply that these observational data don't allow us to reject the null hypothesis. The evidence that non-pharmaceutical interventions made a difference in COVID mortality is inconclusive. We don't have good evidence that they did work in this case. What about the cost side of the ledger with respect to these policies? And, there's not time to go through the research in all these areas, but I'll hit a few points. The response to the COVID pandemic entailed the most extensive and lengthy disruption to education in history. The National Assessment of Educational Progress showed unprecedented drops in student learning in both reading and math. And there has not been any large-scale recovery since the pandemic. That poor recovery likely stems from an increase in chronic absenteeism. Rates of chronic absence from school have doubled relative to their pre-pandemic baselines. Learning losses were greater in high-poverty districts, among Black and Hispanic students, and for students who were struggling academically before the pandemic. The COVID pandemic triggered the largest ever crisis response in United States history. Congress authorized more than $5 trillion in new spending, most of which was allocated to keeping businesses and workers afloat through the closures. Gauged by new spending relative to gross domestic product, 2020 pandemic aid was bigger than the 2009 stimulus package and the whole New Deal combined. 2021 pandemic aid was roughly the same size as the New Deal as a share of gross domestic product. All of these expenditures were added to the national debt. As you can see here, the pandemic response caused an unprecedented rise in the debt to GDP ratio, and this higher debt burden will make responding to the next crisis or recession more difficult. Pandemic policy also affected population health, in addition to the effects of the pandemic alone. There were lengthy delays imposed on non-essential or elective care, followed by significant backlogs once that care resumed. Cancer screening declined drastically. Excess deaths during the pandemic were surprisingly high, even in demographics little affected by COVID. There were surges in deaths due to heart disease, diabetes, overdose, and homicide. Minority populations were especially adversely affected. More than a third of excess deaths among Black Americans are not explained by COVID. Effects on mental health are also well documented, with increases in anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, particularly among children and adolescents, and measurably higher in counties with mandatory social distancing orders. There was also a sharp increase in deaths due to substance abuse and overdose during the pandemic. There's actually a lot more to discuss in terms of the cost side of the ledger, more than we can detail here. The pandemic response stressed the social fabric in numerous ways. There were big effects on the population of downtown business districts and mass transit utilization. And given that recovery remains far from complete here in 2026, there are unanswered questions about the future sustainability of these transit systems. Foot traffic in cities is still now very different from what it looked like before the pandemic. Church attendance and volunteering both continue to be depressed. Indicators of loneliness and social isolation also surged dramatically and have not returned to baselines. Given how much social connectedness contributes to health and happiness, the situation was declared an epidemic by the Surgeon General in 2023. The question then is, what have we learned, if anything, from this episode? During the pandemic, it was claimed that policy should follow the science. But in the wake of the pandemic, we find questions about science and policy more unsettled than ever. We simply haven't learned very much in scientific terms, or that's the assessment of the Scottish government's independent but government-authorized COVID inquiry, which was published in July of 2023. With respect to non-pharmaceutical interventions, this is what the report reads. It says, in 2020, there was scientific evidence to support the use of some of the physical measures adopted against COVID-19, such as frequent hand washing and the use of PPE in hospital settings. For other measures, namely face mask mandates outside of hospital settings, lockdowns, social distancing, test, trace, and isolate measures, there was either insufficient evidence or alternatively no evidence, and the evidence base has not changed materially in the intervening 3 years. The situation is similarly ambiguous on the political front. Democratic and Republican governors all claim credit for handling the pandemic well. Governors across the U.S. remained popular during and after the pandemic, much more popular than national officials, the vast majority of whom had approval ratings above 60%. And they were largely vindicated by their voters. I mean, in addition to Governor Newsom and Governor DeSantis, governors associated with every position on pandemic policy resoundingly won re-election in the aftermath. There's been no convergence of public opinion either about what worked or didn't work. Instead, American public opinion about pandemic policy grew progressively more polarized, more divided, rather than reaching any consensus about what was done or what we might learn from it. Turn it back to Steve.
So just concluding very briefly, other lessons learned. What about public health? So here's some remarks by Francis Collins, director of the National Institutes of Health, the world's biggest funder of healthcare research funding and science research funding in the world. And this is remarks at a Braver Angels panel from July 2023. And I quote, "If you're a public health person, you have this very narrow view of what the right decision is, and that is something that will save a life. It doesn't matter what else happens, so you attach infinite value to stopping the disease and saving a life. You attach zero value to whether this actually totally disrupts people's lives, ruins the economy, and has many kids kept out of school in a way that they never quite recover from. This is a public health mindset, and I think a lot of us involved in trying to make those recommendations had that mindset." And also on the need for public trust and the need for candor, Collins on the same Braver Angels panel, July 2023. "What I did was wrong because I had plenty of these moments in television interviews. We failed to say every time there was a recommendation, guys, this is the best we can do right now. It's a good chance this is wrong. We didn't say that. We wanted to be sure people actually motivated themselves by what we said because we wanted change to happen in case it was right. But we did not admit our ignorance, and that was a profound mistake, and we lost a lot of credibility along the way." On these matters, yes, but not on all matters has there been greater candor. And so we have 2 chapters on the origins of the virus, likely in the Wuhan lab. And I'll just mention this one thing here. Dr. Francis Collins, then director of the National Institutes of Health, was asked in May 2020, asserted, "Neither the NIH nor the National Institutes of Allergic and Infectious Diseases," that's Dr. Fauci's outfit, "have ever approved any grant that would have supported gain-of-function research on coronaviruses that would have increased their transmissibility or lethality for humans. In fact, the National Institutes of Health gave millions of dollars to a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance, Peter Daszak, president. EcoHealth funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars in subawards to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Grant applications from NIH to EcoHealth explicitly spell out work involving the creation of deadlier or more transmissible pathogens. It said that researchers would use infectious clone technology and humanized mice. That sounds really creepy. The lungs are engineered to be more like human lungs, to test the ability of newly created coronaviruses to infect humans. Drs. Fauci and Collins were longtime supporters on the record, supporting gain-of-function research. Many other scientists thought it was extremely dangerous. And we have lots more to say about that. So just one final point on this. Alex Washburn, a microbiologist from Princeton, actually PhD, working out in California, has done some very good work on the genetic sequencing of the novel coronavirus, and has argued and provided considerable evidence that the genetic sequencing strongly suggests a lab origin for the virus. And this is what he said on January 1st, 2026. If we can't pinpoint the origins of a virus that killed 1 million Americans, then we have crossed a dangerous threshold in human history, where we implicitly concede that a virus plausibly, and in my view very likely, made in a military-linked lab of an adversarial foreign government, could be released, kill millions of people around the world, and the people behind it not held accountable. Failure to attribute the origins of SARS-CoV-2 blows a 1 million death hole in the wall of U.S. national security and a 25 million death hole in global health security. Sobering. So finally, I'll just conclude with this, lessons learned. And again, this just takes us back to the original framing in terms of how our, again, the truth-seeking departments of liberal democracy performed under COVID. And I think what we find in part is that unless people within those institutions are committed to the fundamental values of liberalism and science, those institutions are not going to work. So among the things that we think lessons to be learned include greater tolerance of disagreement, greater respect for dissent, recognize the importance of ideological and viewpoint diversity within some of these institutions, for the sake of greater fairness towards arguments with which we disagree, especially those associated with the partisan divide from the other side of the partisan spectrum. Greater honesty, acknowledging uncertainty, especially but not only in public health. Greater openness and transparency in science and science journalism, and acknowledging conflicts of interest. And again, these are the core virtues on which science, journalism, and the academy depend. So thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you here, and we really appreciate you sharing your work with us. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I'm going to turn the Q&A over to our audience, so I'd really encourage the students to be ready with good questions. I see many of my awesome students here. So I wonder first, I want to publicly commend you for writing the book precisely because it's hard, and I want to talk about why that is. I don't agree with everything in the book, but I'm thrilled you wrote it. And I'm really struck by the point that you make about how few retrospectives like this we've had. And so I want to just ask you, you're at a university, of course you work at a university. How can we make epistemic communities like this stronger? How can we make them places where people are better able to raise questions and challenge controversial viewpoints? Some of us are fortunate enough to have the protections of tenure, and yet that doesn't seem to make us any more courageous in these difficult moments. So I wonder if you could talk about that and how you think about this going forward, because even if we come to some more careful conclusions this time, I worry the same pathologies will emerge in the next crisis.
I would say one thing that we can do in our classrooms is to encourage students to come forward, not to self-censor. We've done climate surveys at Princeton. You've probably done them here. Students do, you discover from these surveys that students do engage in self-censorship. And it happens more among students on the right, that they feel less free. So you should try to foster students coming forward and speaking their minds so that you can get a full airing of perspectives. And then they can be addressed and discussed. Like if you don't get a complete representation of the viewpoints that are held in the classroom, then you're not going to be able to address a lot of the concerns that they privately have. And so then the discourse in the classroom becomes distorted. And so I think that happened during COVID. I think there's still a lot of reluctance to discuss the experience of the pandemic, your views on the pandemic. It was a very emotional topic of accusations that if you were not adhering to and even believing in the rules that were imposed, that you were fomenting disobedience and likely to cause death to your fellow citizens. So I mean, it was a very intense episode, difficult to address and difficult to discuss openly. So this is a particularly hard topic, but it's similar to many others that we engage with in departments of politics and government. And so I think that the same problems that we see here in high relief occur in many other topic areas.
I mean, I agree with that, and in my classes, I've been saying, we want to hear from all sides, and also say that we have sort of Chatham House rules. Students are not allowed to report other students' views outside of class. Discuss the ideas, but don't report on students, if you disagree with them and so on. The other thing I think that Francis and I agree on is, the partisan divide is an education divide these days, a diploma divide. So there's a much stronger association in the past between having a four-year college degree, having a graduate degree, especially outside of business and so on, with being a member of the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party has become the party of elite experts to a much greater extent than in the past. And I think we do need to recognize that we need to be very self-conscious in faculty hiring and inviting speakers, in being more attentive to our own biases and seeking out people, from the other side of the political spectrum. Because the depth of partisan identification, as you all know quite well, leads to a form of affective polarization or mutual hatred on both sides, which is bound to affect people in the academy as well, because we're also interested in politics and also often committed in a very moral way to a particular position on public policy matters. So we need to be attentive, I think, to the possible biases that go along with that.
I'm going to ask one more question before we turn it over to the folks in the room. I wonder what you think about the role of the public. The book really foregrounds the role of these truth-seeking communities, journalism, the academy, public health, but of course, public opinion is playing a powerful role here. One of the things your critics have raised is that the disadvantaged groups that you quite rightly point out often suffer disproportionate harm, or often some of the most supportive of the lockdowns. Politicians seem to have been responding to public demand, and I wonder how we can counter the demand to do something. When I was not much older than the students in this room, 9/11 happened, and we can all, those of us who are older, can remember the powerful demand to do something and the often quite misguided decisions that were made in that moment. And it seems like politicians were facing a similar kind of dilemma during COVID. So I wonder, what would a different version of doing something look like that we could employ in a future crisis?
And you're absolutely right that the measures, when they were imposed in spring of 2020, were enormously popular. They were hugely, overwhelmingly popular, and including across both parties. Public opinion evolved over time, and it took on an increasing partisan character, but it did not have that at the outset. And in one sense, you might say American democracy worked in that the policies were devolved down to the state level and down to localities, and the policies in those places often reflected the opinion of the residents. That Democrats were much more supportive of these measures and adherent to them than Republicans. So we can do studies of cell phone mobility studies of who was actually staying home, not just the policies, but the compliance with the policies. And that was heavily structured by party as well. So it's amazing the extent to which the partisanship of the COVID response went all the way down to the individual level. And you might rightly say, well, in the end, people were getting basically what they want. I would say there's a cautionary note there's some really interesting work on school closures done by Vladimir Kogan at Ohio State. And what he has found is that public opinion takes cues from policy. And so when schools would reopen in these areas that were heavily supportive of the school closures, but when they would reopen, then public opinion would follow and support the reopening. That when schools are closed, people tend to assume that these local officials are doing the right thing. And so there's a cue taking, there's a opinion leadership role from policy there. So it's more complex than just a simple following of public opinion.
It reminds me, H.L. Mencken said that democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and they ought to get it good and hard. I mean, it's important that public opinion be informed by expertise on these matters. The pre-COVID pandemic planning documents were emphatic that these measures had a very weak evidentiary base, their success was highly uncertain, and that they would be associated with considerable costs, certainly. And public opinion was misinformed systematically by news coverage, by journalists, that those books that I put up by Sanjay Gupta and so on, he starts off with 4 COVID deaths at the beginning of the book. They're all extremely unusual cases of young people, athletes, and so on dying of COVID. That did happen. COVID was a bad pandemic, but they were highly unrepresentative, and those are the 4 cases that he starts with and the only cases that he starts with as representative. Deborah Birx did the same thing. The news media focused on rare cases of young people dying. In the UK, the BBC was approached by SAGE, one of the advisory groups, and told young people are not fearful enough. We need to ramp up the messaging in their pandemic. So fear was used there as an instrument of public policy to get people to comply, and people were misled. So being frank with the public, being candid with the public, again, those pre-COVID pandemic planning documents emphasize the responsibility of experts and so on to be candid and frank with the public so that public opinion might reflect that to a greater extent.
I know we've got a lot of student questions, so let's turn to those, and we'll ask for questions, not speeches, to get as many people in as possible.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. So I wanted to ask, I know you talked a lot about how there was no evidence that these COVID shutdowns were necessarily effective in preventing mortality. And I was kind of just wondering, do you think that these shutdowns were at all justified, that any duration of them were justified at all, or do you think that it was kind of entirely unnecessary and should not have occurred at all in the first place?
I mean, you could say Dr. Mark Woolhouse in the UK, a Scottish epidemiologist, wrote one of the first books on the COVID response there called The Year the World Went Mad. He supported the first lockdown measures at the time. Looking back on them, he says that the evidence showed that the cases were already coming down by the time those measures were implemented. And there's, again, a lack of evidence, not proving that they didn't work, but a lack of evidence showing that they did work. Viruses come in natural waves. They rise and they peak and they fall off. And so we lack evidence that they were effective. I mean, you understand the fear, you understand the panic. I think Francis and Nate, maybe one thing we slightly disagree upon is whether it's sort of understandable, or maybe understandable. I don't want to say justifiable because we lack evidence for it, that these measures were imposed for a time. They were imposed across the United States. Mike DeWine in Ohio was the first one to impose a statewide school closures. So, you know, there was a lot of consensus then. I think the major thing that it was a failure to learn as time went on. Again, we mentioned in class the fact that many European countries reopened their schools in April and May 2020. European education ministers put out a statement in May 14th, 2020, saying our schools have been open for 3 or 4 weeks. We're not seeing significant evidence of transmission. They're remaining open without incident. So it wasn't just the initial panic, but it was the sustained inability, I think, to learn from experience of other places and to recalibrate and to change course that was extremely problematic.
I mean, if there'd been a little more acknowledgement at the outset that we don't know for sure what will work, then it would have been more feasible to learn, even if some of the initial policies were misguided. Public officials would have been in a better position to adjust. And they would have also been able to justify those the adjustments they made in light of emerging evidence. But it was treated as, you know, fixed, settled science. We're following the science. It was very, you know, it was a portrait of decision making that didn't leave much room for maneuver afterwards.
Thank you again for coming to speak. My question was about the way in which public opinion might have impacted the response in a democratic society. How did our response, or the response of democratic countries, compare to the response of non-democratic countries like China or Russia?
I don't have a great sense for comparisons to non-democratic countries. The public opinion in non-democratic countries, I think, is quite difficult to study. I can say one thing that is very apparent when we compare public opinion in the U.S. to other democracies is that our response, the politics of the pandemic response, much more party polarized, much more divided along pre-existing party lines. There were divisions in other countries, and a fair bit of protest against COVID restrictions that didn't get a lot of news coverage, but it was a persistent phenomenon, but it just didn't break down along party lines in quite the same way. So that's what I see as the big difference between the U.S. and most other democracies on this, during this time.
I mean, the Chinese case had a huge demonstration effect. We saw, but it was really Italy's imposed the first national lockdown, and that showed that a democracy was willing to go along with these measures that had not been contemplated before. That actually was a profound surprise to many people. So the cascade started from Italy and then across Europe as well across the United States, a lot of policy copying. So the Chinese example was important, but then the willingness of the Italians to endure and indeed to call for a national lockdown was also extremely important.
I mean, there was great public clamor for these measures. People thought that they would work, that they would help. And that was why, Boris Johnson reversed course in the UK. It was under the pressure of this public demand to do what's being done in other countries. So the extent to which governments were copying one another, I think, is a very important part of the phenomenon.
Thank you guys for speaking. How do you differentiate issues where we need intellectual humility from issues where we can have larger certainty, and particularly when the stakes are so high and we don't have a lot of time to really ponder and make these decisions? How do we go about doing that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the role of the truth-seeking organizations, they need to be cautious not to get over their skis. They shouldn't make claims that aren't well-founded. That's different. Obviously, elected officials have to make decisions under tremendous uncertainty. That's their responsibility. That's what we ask them to do. But what I think we saw during COVID was a tendency for public officials to sort of hide behind science advisors and to say that we're just following the science. We're not exercising any discretion at all. We're just doing what the science dictates. And I think that there shouldn't have been a permission structure created around that, because the science was simply not that strong.
There were many scientists, dozens of scientists in March, who expressed extreme reservations about the measures that would be undertaking. Dr. Greg Gonsalves, who's a professor at Yale, organized a letter and had 800 signatures in early March, repeating what the ACLU said in 2008, that lockdown measures would have severe disproportionate effects on minority communities, voluntary is better, and so on. He completely swung to the other side of the spectrum by October when the Great Barrington Declaration came out. It's a little unclear why, but he was strong and quite intolerant of dissent. I think there were many people who retained reservations about these matters, but there was such a strong consensus, and there's no question that people were disparaged for dissenting. And of course, I think dissent might weaken public support for the measures, which we were uncertain about. So I think there was a considerable amount of intolerance, I think even in university communities, around dissent from these measures. We talked to people at various universities and medical schools who had to resign their positions, doctors who were seen as engaging in a kind of malpractice by dissenting from various of the non-pharmaceutical measures. So I think that the groupthink around these matters, the intolerance to dissent, was another major part of it.
Thank you. You had noted how schools, it took a little bit longer to open up, across the country versus, I guess, the rest of the United States. Do you think that perhaps the reason schools opened up a little bit later than the rest of the country had something to do with maybe teachers' unions, and if so, how?
That's been shown to have, teachers' unions, the strength of teachers' unions has been shown in analyses of the length of school closures to have an additional effect in addition to the partisan divide. The partisanship of the jurisdiction, however, remains the single best predictor of the length of school closures. So I think it's a public opinion story first, and then there's an organizational side to the story. Obviously, private and Catholic schools reopen more quickly than public schools, so that's another organizational aspect of the story.
Yeah. And there's no relation between the school closures and severity of the pandemic. Another impact of COVID has been that publicly funded school choice programs have taken off in Republican states in particular. The American public school system, devoting public dollars to public schools for the sake of public purposes, is a hallowed institution in American politics going back to the 1830s, 1840s. Now every Republican state has a publicly funded school choice program, which is a huge departure from 10 or 15 years ago. We know scholars who work in that space, and they thought public school choice was more or less dead because people were adopting it, but there's been a big shift on that.
I see one of my colleagues up there with his hand up, Professor Woloshin.
Thanks. So one of you said something about that there was a failure to learn, and I couldn't agree more. So my question is, why didn't we do more learning? I mean, it's one thing to look at what's happening in other countries or other parts of the country, but that's not what I mean by learning. It's systematic research studies. The NPI, like your slide from Nicola Sturgeon, there's really weak evidence before, during, and now still. Social distancing, school closures, masking. It's really bewildering how little research there is, and I just wonder why that is. Some of us tried to track that early on, looking at the investment in pharmacologic versus non-pharmacologic research, and it was just shocking. I wonder if you have any insights.
Well, one thing our book doesn't do a lot of, and you could regard it as it's revealed a fair criticism of the book, is that we don't do a lot of investigating the why. We tell the story, and it's quite mystifying at some points, like the existence of debate right on the eve, expert debate in public, in news outlets, right on the eve of the decisions to issue stay-at-home orders, and then the dissipation of dissent after. So, but the explanation of why, it's hard to know. I will speculate on one point. I think that looking towards the presidential election of the fall of 2020, I think kept us in a kind of limbo state. And and the pandemic, of course, was very much a bone of contention in the lead up to the election, with Democrats criticizing strongly the administration's handling of COVID. And so I think that overarching partisan narrative and the coincidence with a highly partisan national election, I think helps to explain the growth of the partisan structuring in public opinion, and the sort of the failure to take on new information. It was just a doubling and tripling down on the narratives that seemed to be useful to carry the day in the elections. So that's purely speculative, not something the book argues. We don't attempt to explain the why on that very important question.
Graham Allison, one of the world's leading scholars of crisis decision-making, put out a document in April 2020 arguing that we were doubling down on a strategy that was doubtful. There wasn't a broad enough range of experts involved. The assumptions seemed to be hardening. And so we argued we needed a red team, devil's advocates, and a wider group of experts to be involved in decision-making. This was just few weeks after the Saffer Center report. That Saffer Center report got tremendous national coverage, many op-eds and so on. Allison got no coverage whatsoever. So I think an elite consensus developed, and it has persisted. We don't know of any law school conferences on the interventions by the Biden administration with the social media companies suppressing information at odds with government policy. We know of very few university conferences looking back on this. And on the origins of the virus itself, Nature magazine put out an article in February of this past year saying more and more evidence that the virus came from the wet market and from animals and so on. They quote 6 scientists, all of whom have been on record for that, some of whom switched their positions after a private phone call with Dr. Fauci, while saying in private, it's just so likely it came from the lab. I hate it when science is politicized. It's just so friggin' likely it came from the lab. We have their email messages, their Slack messages saying this to one another while they took a different position in public. So there's been a silence going on now 6+ years afterwards, and an unwillingness to look. So that's very disturbing. 60 Minutes has done, the CBS News program, 6 episodes on Havana syndrome, which I think affects 100, maybe something people, people near embassies who develop brain issues, and there's maybe thought microwaves, energy. They haven't done a single issue on the origins of the virus, or which has affected millions around the world. So it's very surprising, and it does persist.
We'll take one more student question, and then Brendan gets the final question.
My question was related to your decision to publish a book specifically about all this information, because everything that I heard today in class and during this talk has been incredibly shocking. I had absolutely no idea about the evidence you presented about the lack of scientific evidence for the masking and social mandates working. And so I'm curious, in the current environment where a lot of the media we consume is very quick and in short form, why a book when it seems like your research and the implications for it are so incredibly important, not just for public health, but also democracy?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, we were directing ourselves to our academic community. I mean, we published the book with a university press. It has lots of footnotes. When you decide to approach publishing research in that sort of way, you don't anticipate there to be displays in bookstores. It's not the quickest way to get attention. But we wanted it to have some credibility with other experts, so we tried to speak that language. It's also the language we know. I don't really know how to go viral. So we're doing what we know, and then we hope it can have a ripple influence. Yeah.
Yeah, I was working on a book on several issues where I thought progressives weren't paying enough attention to conservative voices, and when I started looking into this, and then Frances joined on. I mean, she was skeptical that we could get the book published, and actually the editor, who was a good friend of mine at Princeton University Press, said several times at least, "Are you sure you want to do this?" But it's too important a story, and it's actually the material we were coming across, and there's still much more there. We've barely scratched the surface. There's much more in the historical record around the origins of the virus and other matters.
And the policy advising process, how these decisions were made,
Yeah.
and then the experts who were most knowledgeable in this space and the views they had before versus the views they took publicly during the crisis.
Relationship to previous policy follies like the Vietnam War. I mean, several people have pointed out the analogies with David Halberstam's the best and the brightest, and mistakes that were made there. And again, failure to learn over the course of time and be frank with the public about the bad news that wasn't being reported from Vietnam and so on. So we know of a graduate student at Oxford that's working on this. We know of very few others, but there's really quite a lot there to continue to dig into.
All right, well, I guess I get the last question. So I wonder maybe if you could say just a word about what people might take away from this in their own lives, because I guess one thing I've reflected on after reading the book is the ways in which debate can be shut down in our current moment, even when we're in truth-seeking institutions, by the invocation of the other side or a negative consequence. So there's this kind of constant threat hanging over us at all times that it's perceived that if we say something, we're aiding someone who's not on our side, or we're potentially causing some outcome that's harmful. And of course, you could always say that those kinds of concerns were there when people speak publicly about sensitive issues, but obviously our era of heightened polarization has really compounded that. So I wonder if you could say something just about how people can carry this idea forward. So for instance, I want to make clear, I have a very different read of the lab leak evidence than these folks do, but we benefit from being a society where they are challenging it, right? It's not something that I would rule out of bounds at all. And I think it's precisely the obsession with trying to police those boundaries and say, I know what's best for us, is to not have the debate because that debate could have bad consequences of X, Y, Z, right? It turns out that actually truth-seeking for the sake of truth-seeking is really valuable. So I wonder if you could talk just a little about how we could make that idea more concrete, because I know we can all say that in the abstract, but it can get hard in real life.
I mean, I think this case offers a cautionary tale of how policy extremism can result from a failure to engage with critics. If you don't hear any dissenting voices, you think there's no reason to dissent. And so you can kind of go off the deep end in policy terms in an environment like that. So I think it's a cautionary tale. So you can map it on to other debates in that sort of way. And so that's one way to think about it going forward. But I find it just a troubling period as I lived through it, and as I reflect back on it, it's disturbing that on matters of such importance, of such vast consequence, I mean, that we could take policies on such poor foundation that were so costly and not have a debate about it, and still in retrospect not have a debate about it. It shows just how far we can go.
I think there are other issues where people have assumed that they know the right conclusions and are not open enough to dissent on those conclusions. And I do think often it's in a partisan way, and I think we have to look critically on areas where there seems to be a consensus. And again, I do think the partisan divide is a major piece of that. It's not the only thing, but listen to voices from the other side. I think organizations that attempt to do that very specifically, the Braver Angels Forum that I mentioned before, again, tries to very explicitly bridge that partisan divide. Francis Collins was having an interview there, back and forth with someone who run a trucking company who strongly dissented from the COVID measures, whose business was harmed very severely. And they developed an online connection during that. And good for Francis Collins for being willing to participate in that. And so I think you're all trying to do that here as well, and we strongly encourage it.
All right, please join me in thanking our guests.